This is Scenic Roots talking writing. Our guest, Deborah Levine, is an award-winning author of 15 books. She's editor-in-chief of the American Diversity Report and a Forbes magazine diversity and inclusion trailblazer. Her most recent work is a radio play based on letters written by her father Aaron and her mother Estelle when her father was in Europe during the Second World War. Also included in the play are letters written by a survivor of one of the Nazi death camps, Leon Weisband. Her father worked in US military intelligence during the war. Near the end of the war, he was one of the soldiers who freed the survivors in some of the Nazi concentration camps. After the war, he interviewed hundreds of Germans in an attempt to understand why they were so willing to accept the lies propagated by the Nazis during the war. It mystified him, this degree of denial on the part of the German people he spoke to. If you would read that, and then we'll go back and talk about your father's role. And I have to say, one of the things that struck me, Deb, your father, not surprisingly, really didn't want to talk about this. You quote him towards the end of the play saying, "I've had enough of this." He was so deeply immersed in trying to understand what had happened in Germany and why the German people had behaved the way they did and why it had happened. And as you said before, it resonates today because we see much of the same kind of thinking that's dividing this country. But the striking thing about what your dad says is that while the majority of people in Germany in the Second World War were not members of the Nazi Party, they didn't really stand against it.
Well, I first would like to share that it's very true that Dad did not like to discuss this. In fact, I had no idea that he had kept the letters, the one that I'm going to be reading to you shortly, in a file cabinet hidden away in his closet. I only found out after I had taken a job with the Jewish Federation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing, and was there to do the community liaison work and the media work, and dealt with the neo-Nazi movement in Oklahoma at the time. And we're talking early 1990s, mid-1990s, and was trained by the FBI in security for good reason. My father kind of had a meltdown over this, jumped on a plane, came out to Tulsa to make sure that his baby girl was being taken care of, and that's when I found out so much. And I even arranged for a radio interview with him. Now, the letters then that I got to see, many of them I read at the time, but they were so difficult, emotional for me. It took me a long time to complete them all and then to share them. But given what's going on today, how can I not? So I would like to do it with this one letter in particular. I have talked to enough Germans in the past months to fill a good-sized section of Milwaukee, and all types. Army generals and SAA bums, a.k.a. stormtroopers in brown shirts. Miners and artists, professors and pimps, solid farmers and crafty businessmen, children, octogenarians, whores and spies. Confront them with the truth and they cannot believe it. A German army doctor told me that he had been in Russia for a year and never once heard of any German atrocities. Oh, yes, they hung a few people one night and forgot to cut down the bodies for a few days. But everything else was propaganda. He also told me that some of his best friends were Jews, but one night they all disappeared, and he never did get around to inquiring about what had happened to them.
Your dad's name is Aaron.
Yes, Aaron
And
Levine.
many of the segments in the script are from Aaron's letters.
Yes.
There are also segments in the script attributed to Leon Weisband,
Yes.
who was a survivor of one of the camps. So in your play, you've woven together your dad, both his reaction when he first saw one of the death camps at the end of the war, his conversations with, as we just illustrated, with the German people after the war. And then having talked about this in the play with some remove, you've taken into the heart of it.
Yes.
With Leon's testimony of what it was like to be in one of those camps, which is just unimaginable. Truly unimaginable, I think. You know, it doesn't matter how many times people tell us what it was like. You have no idea how it must feel to wake up every morning in that same reality, you know.
To interweave the first-hand accounts of a liberator and a Holocaust survivor has been both an emotional challenge and quite an honor. I'm delighted that a friend sent me Leon Weisband's original letters so that I could share them in this manner. But it's not easy. I know it's not easy to read and hear, but how else can history be made real and come alive unless you hear from the people who lived in it like this?
Which was your father's reason for doing what he did, right? For keeping the letters and for...
Yes, in many ways it was. He was a literary man, educated. He was a first-generation American Jewish man whose immigrant family came from the Ukraine area. He had worked hard and gone to Harvard. And so...
He worked really hard.
Yes, he did.
He worked against the odds, didn't he?
Against many odds.
When he was in grade school, and he had to repeat the 12th grade because he started so young.
He flunked out. And I think the pressures on him and that generation of immigrants was immense. And it wasn't easy to continue on, but he did. As did my mother, by the way, who went to Radcliffe, the women's college, associated with Harvard.
So that's how they met.
That's how they met.
Because your mom grew up in
Bermuda.
Bermuda, yeah.
In Bermuda. And she had this sweet, loving, kind personality that my father just fell in love with at first sight, first hearing, and never gave up. And she was only probably 16 when she got there. She was young.
Wow.
Yeah, really young.
That is young to be starting university. So she must have skipped a couple of grades in grade school, huh?
Well, when you're going to British schools,
gotcha.
It's a bit different.
Yeah, that's true.
So both she and her sister, Polly, who is also in the play, went to Ivy League schools young, and maybe one of the few Bermudian families to have done something like that.
Yeah, because if it's anything like the way it works in the UK, 16 is one point, and then you go 2 more years, and if you get through those exams, then you go on to university. So your mum and her sister were still accelerated.
Yes, they were. They were very smart.
Evidently, yeah.
And but my mother was very soft-spoken. Polly said that my mother was a saint, but she was not. Quite true, Polly. Quite true.
Did you grow up in Bermuda?
Yes, I did, and I went to the same school that my mother had attended, Bermuda High School for Girls.
So your dad, after the war, and when he came back to the States, he moved to Bermuda?
Yes.
You as a family moved to Bermuda?
Yes, the whole family. Originally, we started back in New York, but we went to Bermuda very quickly, so that although I was born in Brooklyn, I only stayed in the States for a few months before growing up in Bermuda. And we did move back to the States when I was about 7 or 8. Dad wanted us to have a formal Jewish community, which did not exist on the island. We, my family, are still the only Jewish family to have lived on the island and worked for 4 generations.
Really?
We're it.
So while in some respects, I think most of us would think of Bermuda as something of a paradise, a pretty tropical island.
It is.
Politically, it was a bit fraught.
Well, the location of Bermuda was extremely important during the war, so that there was an American base, Bermuda base. There were ships and sailors all over the island in those days, and my grandparents had the Jewish USO in their own family home, and the British kept a center for interpretation there on the island, so they could deal with many different languages and know what was going on. So it was quite a hub for the war, and quite some time afterwards, submarines there and whatnot. I don't believe that is the case anymore.
But you mentioned in the play that there was also a measure of anti-Semitism on the island.
Unfortunately, the anti-Semitism that was reflected, certainly in Nazi Germany, was not rare in the rest of Europe. And even here in America, you must know that there was a major neo-Nazi kind of gathering at Madison Square Garden around 1940.
Really?
Indeed, it was amazing here in the States. So they did not quite know what to do in Bermuda, tourist-wise, with so many Jews coming in. But they were not welcome in many places, and even though we were quite welcome there, my grandparents, my grandfather was not allowed to become a member of the local golf club, for example.
So while your mum was from Bermuda, and so naturally your parents moved there, as you said, at some point your dad wanted you to be part of a Jewish community.
Yes.
And that, I guess, is...
That's why
he had so much trouble, I think, with all of this. You know, it was so close to him, and I got the impression that when he finally was able to join the army, apparently your dad was pretty slight, not a big man. So he didn't pass the physical the first time. He finally passed the physical. He's inducted into the army, and then because of his background, they asked him to be part of this. What do you call that? This department, I guess, that was designed to interrogate the Germans. But what was his role during the war? How did that work during the war when the war was still going on?
So when he was first allowed to sign up, right, he went to regular boot camp, and he told me a story about being there digging ditches. And the sergeant came and said, so Levine, you want to keep digging ditches or you want to go to U.S. military intelligence camp? Well, that was pretty clear what he chose. And he said when he reported to the sergeant, he was called Mr. Levine for the first time ever in the Army. and given a ticket to Fort Ritchie in Maryland, and telling everyone to keep it secret. Keep it secret, because it was a secret installation, and many of the people there were Jewish and had a German background, and they were assigned indeed to not just interrogate Nazi prisoners of war, but to basically sound out the population as to where the German troops were. And so Dad, whose French was much better than his German, was frequently talking to people in France and Belgium about the troops and where they were headed. When I saw his discharge papers for the first time, this was after he had passed away, I was stunned to see that what they called him was a spy.
Mm. Well, essentially that's what he was, right?
I guess he was. He never called himself
Intelligence
that.
is another word for that, right?
I guess so. Like I said, he was not inclined to talk about it. He was probably, though, very good at it. And what we found in his papers is that he was actually in charge of a group of people who were translators on behalf of the army.
So at the end of the war, he, as you put it in the script, he stumbled on this camp.
Yes.
And that was his first exposure to one of the Nazi death camps, which I didn't realize, as you mentioned in the script, existed before the war broke out, that they'd been established since the early 30s.
Yes, in the 30s, yes. Germans had established many different camps, and they were thousands of people in them. But this particular camp that he wrote about, and it's not the only one that he saw, but this one called Nordhausen was hidden under a hill next to a hospital and had a Red Cross on it so that the Allies wouldn't bomb it. It was horrifying as he described it, with the thousands of dead bodies piled up. The smell, I don't think he ever really recovered from. How could you, How could you?
Yeah, sometimes I think our sense of smell is our most powerful sense.
Well, it certainly was for him. When I was in high school, and I said to him, maybe I should study German. That did not go over well, and it wasn't ever going to happen.
And yet, after the war, your dad interrogated, as we mentioned earlier, a range of people from Germany. So I'm assuming at that point he had to use his German.
Oh, yes, he always used his German.
So his German got better.
His German improved again and again, and it was an excellent skill that he had. And he interrogated prisoners of war of all kinds, as you could see from his letters. And it must have been so hard for him. I remember, in the 60s, Dad decided to take us all to Europe to see where he had been stationed in France and England. Before I went to Harvard, he hoped I would have a bit of a exposure to the world. So I was tremendously intellectual, but not very worldly. So we were one day in Paris at the gardens of the Tuileries Gardens, and there was a gentleman standing not too far from us, all by himself, and my father just stared at him, sighed, and then went over to him, helped him with a map, took care of him, came back shaking like a leaf. I said, "Dad, what's going on?" He said, "Well, that was a German, and I knew he was lost, and I knew there wasn't a Frenchman on the planet that was going to help him. And I just had to make sure he could go where he needed to go." And I said, "How did you know he was German?" And he said, "You got to be kidding. The man is wearing tweed in the middle of the summer and festooned with cameras all over himself. Who else would he be?" I don't know. I guess so. But it was educational to see what it did to my dad physically, just to speak German again for a few minutes.
Well, it strikes me, Deb, that one of the challenges of learning another language is learning to think in that language. And so you start to get inside the culture. For your dad to get inside that culture at the end of the war must have been incredibly wrenching.
Well, you read his letters and understand that he struggled to stay sane. He smoked every cigarette he could get a hold of, a habit he had to give up after the war because it got to him. And the love of my mother, Estelle, and her letters she wrote him every day, right, sustained him, at least helped sustain him. But he was always thinking of the consequences and the future and what would need to happen to make this go away, make it better. The re-education that was absolutely necessary if Germany and the world that had bought into this Nazi ridiculousness were not to change direction radically.
Your dad was a historian, so he thought like a historian.
Yes, Dad was a historian. He studied history and literature at Harvard, got a master's degree in American history and lit, and in his retirement became the chief financial officer of the American Jewish Archives, knowing that history was so vital for humanity's sake.
I can only imagine that perhaps it was heartening for him to see that in subsequent generations in Germany, people were thinking the same way he was, that this was a scar on a beautiful culture that had to be excised somehow. And the only way you can excise it is to come to terms with it. It's a bit like, Tutu in South Africa,
Yes, indeed. Well, he did go back to Germany in his retirement. And that was somewhat of a controversial movement. Many people said no Jews should ever set foot in Germany. And many of those who had lived there did immigrate elsewhere. There was still a Jewish community there that he wanted to visit and see for himself and travel a bit. He was delighted to see that there was a community there, but in his travels he met people who were still against the Jewish people. It never quite goes away, does it? And it's back.
How was it for you to immerse yourself in this material?
Well, as I said in the beginning, I could only do a little bit at a time. Mm. And the more I read, the more I realized I needed to write about this. So I started writing The Liberator's Daughter maybe 20 years ago when my father was still alive. And I remember sending him the first chapter, and he said, you're coming along. I knew what that meant. It has taken me quite some time to be able to write the book and then the scripts. And then I realized that my mother had left all the letters too, and read hers and intertwine them. Amazing. About a woman who was sort of back at the home front, dealing with all of this. She was a pioneer in special education and was needed in Bermuda during those times. and became a teacher, even though my older brother was still a youngster. It was something that she was passionate about helping. Both my parents were very humane people in their own way. Mom eventually became the education director at Rockdale Temple in Cincinnati, Ohio, and had me teach for her. I didn't want to, by the way. I wanted my own life, but she bribed me. She said, I'll give you the best classroom in the whole synagogue. Well, I don't know. And she said, I'll give you the best student intern we've got. The idea of passing it along to a young person, I could not say no. And that's when I first became a teacher.
I think the abiding impression that I have of your mum from her letters is how empathic she is. She understood exactly what was happening, but she never addressed it. She just responded to it in a very supportive way, like, I can see what's happening. I can see how you must be feeling. And she was just so supportive, so embracing.
My mother, oh my goodness, Dad used to say that she taught him how to love. And she taught us all how to love. But she was the most supportive. And I remember one of her letters to my father saying, would you like me to write to General Eisenhower to make sure you have a vacation?
I'm sure he didn't get any letters like that.
Yeah.
Thank you for writing this, Deb.
Thank you.
Was it cathartic for you at all?
Given what is happening in the world today, I felt that while the books were wonderful and a great asset for educators and others, that there needed to be a larger voice. I had been asked to do a script, a movie script, like this years ago. And I tried my hand on it, and I was terrible at it.
But it's so difficult to write about.
It's so difficult to write about, and it's another genre. But by the way, I have completed a TV pilot script about my life and submitted it to a number of international film festivals and has already been accepted here and there.
So you think somebody's going to produce the film?
I hope so. But the radio theater script came as an idea from a cousin. She has been in the radio and theater world for 20 years. And she kind of pushed me quite a bit. And her dad, my Uncle Saul Levine, was in the Pacific Theater, right? But Saul and Aaron, the two brothers, were very close. How could I not let her help me move it into a radio script, which is what you see? And then her brother, Michael, who is a composer in Hollywood, was kind enough to produce the music for this radio theater play, which you're going to be amazed at. Is just phenomenal. So the family has come together to support what I've done, and that has made it so much easier.
The play by Deborah Levine is called Untold, Stories of a World War II Liberator, based on letters written by her father, Aaron Levine, who was in the US military intelligence during the war, and Leon Weisband, who was a survivor of one of the Nazi death camps in the Second World War. The play was written for radio and will have its broadcast debut here on WUTC next month, Saturday, June 18th at 7 o'clock.